We're here.
We are here.
We made it. Long time coming.
I don't know about a long time coming.
Literally hours of planning.
Yeah. maybe a few. Not a lot. It was just, hey, we should do this. Yeah.
And here we are.
Why are we here? What do you think? What is this? What are we doing?
We thought that there was something lacking in the podcast world.
Yeah. There's not enough podcasts.
Yeah, we needed one more podcast.
There's too little podcasts. That's what it was. And
Absolutely.
we thought we should do that because there needs to be more of that because there's so few options.
Basically, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I get on my Apple podcast and I'm scrolling around and
you're like, I've listened to the 3 that are on here, and what else am I going to do now?
Yeah, I mean,
with my time.
Here's the thing: there's so much potential in podcasts, but it just hasn't been tapped into at this point.
Yeah.
So I actually think that.
I think that's true. I mean, so there's some truth to that, and it's interesting because you listen to some of the people who do podcasts, and like, for example, Rogan's, the most well-known podcaster, and he tries to convince everybody that's on his show to do a podcast. I mean, he thinks there's no ceiling to it. We see this kind of stuff in life, that there's booms in different things. Like everybody has a blog. Yeah. Everybody's getting a podcast kind of thing. Yeah. So there's a sense in which, like, if I think the reason we were doing this was because we wanted to hop on a bandwagon and we felt like everybody's doing it, we should do it, we have something excellent to contribute, then that would be a sorry reason for us to be doing this.
Definitely true.
I don't think that's where our intentions are. I think you and I have both felt like, again, thinking about somebody like Rogan, and he's an interesting person to bring up because he's obviously not a Christian. You and I are Christians. We both either have been to seminary or are currently in that process. So we have a pretty explicitly Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. Rogan definitely does not have a Christian worldview. Seems like he's all over the place in terms of his thinking.
He has sympathies for a Christian worldview, but not
maybe
he wouldn't identify as one.
Certainly not, and has some rather ridiculous things to say about the Christian worldview. Absolutely. And I don't think he's ever had to actually talk to anyone for the kind of people that he's had on his show, scientists and celebrities and people who are really intelligent. I don't think he's ever, from what I can tell, had to talk to anybody who I thought, that's a person who I would think is a Christian, who has a consistent Christian worldview, who can articulate that well. Yeah. So sometimes when he's, of what I've heard, when he's broached the topic, it's been pretty like, okay, you don't know what the Christian worldview is, or it's a somewhat like sort of, it's like he grew up Catholic, I think, maybe.
I'm not sure.
And it seems like his familiarity with Christianity is probably like a sort of parody form of Catholicism.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think you hear him kind of reducing Christianity to a lot of just things that you would hear,
culturally,
cultural thing. Yeah. So, obviously he knows about, Moses, the burning bush. He knows about King David. He knows about Christ, the love your neighbor as yourself kind of thing. But I think the way that he dismisses Christianity is pretty elementary. It's,
right.
Constantine created the New Testament. Kind of stuff.
Yeah. Or it's that sort of like the Bible is the telephone game. Why would we listen to something that's been translated hundreds of times? Yeah. Even though that's not really how that works. Yeah. And our translations aren't based on translations on translations on translations. Yeah. But it's a very sort of typical way of viewing it. But
he is onto something.
Yeah, I think that's why I brought
podcasting.
Yeah. Well, that's why I brought him up because, well, he's obviously very popular. He's the most popular podcaster in the world, signed a huge deal, exclusive deal to Spotify. And Gospel Coalition recently released an article on, sort of the merits of his style, that there's something for us as Christians to consider in the style of primarily just the fact that he can sit down with somebody, and his podcasts are primarily interviews, and that his goal is to be a very sort of welcoming and kind. He wants to create a space in which people can talk through ideas, and that truth can have its day, so to speak. He doesn't want to bring any kind of agenda to any topics. I mean, unless you hear him talk about drugs, then it's pretty obvious he has an agenda there. But if he's talking about, politics or philosophy, he's pretty willing to let people sort of go, kind of prompt them and let them go. Yeah. And as the article kind of insinuated, there's a value to that as Christians for us to think about, especially in this sort of social media age.
I was gonna say, it's about the opposite of social media.
Well, yeah. Well, the opposite of Twitter for sure,
Facebook as well.
Well, yeah. I just think Twitter you think about what Rogan's doing. It's a 2-hour long form conversational podcast, which couldn't be more opposite than 240 characters. Yeah. People try to do these threads, but it doesn't work. And the sad thing is Twitter becomes this strange space where these controversial ideas get brought up that everyone's just sort of trying to talk about and missing and talking past each other. And it's just not a useful way, I think, for us as Christians to deal with controversial topics. And yet somehow it always becomes that. It always becomes, even in Christian Twitter, so to speak, you have people who post something and, did you see what so-and-so posted? And now it's this whole debate about some particular view that they have or theological statement. It's not just controversy in the Christian world over can you believe they said this insensitive thing? It's usually a theological controversy that gets spurred by that. But it's a terrible medium.
Oh, for sure.
To hash out theological disagreement.
Well, that's because it's easy to jab someone, right, with just a quick gotcha tweet. Yeah. But it's difficult to actually have to discourse through that and actually, okay, hey, these are the reasons why you're wrong. I think that this is a better way of thinking about things.
Right.
That's not going to happen on Twitter because the impact is made by just that shock of, you have a limited amount of time to get someone's attention on Twitter.
Yep.
And to do that, you got 240 characters, and there's only so much substance that can actually take place.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you get this sort of, like you said, there's this desire to respond, or even just, I think you can't discount the fact that behind a lot of that, there's this idea that everyone's seeing it's like everybody's seeing us have this back and forth, and you want everyone to be on your side, and there's so much to that doesn't put you in a position to be fair and to be willing to actually understand what the person's saying, because there's even clear instances every day of, okay, well, wait a minute, that's not what the person's trying to say. And even in terms of articles that get shared, people share an article where the good thing about an article is you have time to flesh out an idea. An author's presenting a fully formed idea, and yet even still it gets shared, and you wonder, you read comments and you go, okay, you didn't read the article. You got halfway into the article, you went straight to the comment section, and you said this because you immediately decided, I disagree with this, or here's what's wrong with this.
And you can, the thing about Twitter is you can post an article and then sort of create your own headline for it. Whatever you want to tweet about this article becomes the first impression that people get about, whatever.
Right. Yeah. You're the one who told them how they should think about the article.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's appealing. But yeah, so I think
it's also disconnected from, we hit on this a little bit, but there's no personal aspect to it. It's so disconnected from real life that people will, and this has been well documented and just noted and observed, but people will say things on Twitter that they would never say, face to face.
Right.
And that's pretty problematic, I think, especially for Christians, because, we're called to be gentle. We're called to be winsome.
Yeah.
Right. We're called to be able to answer each person, but in a way that is Christ-like.
Yeah.
And it's much harder to convey gentleness over Twitter. Yeah. You can do it, but again, with limited space, you're trying to get ideas across.
Well, it's so hard to communicate tone over social media.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of one of the values of conversations, vocal or whatever, is that you can tell what the person's tone is. So if I say, wow, this is really great, and am I being sarcastic? Am I being enthusiastic? It's hard to tell, and tone can have a huge impact on that. Yeah, I mean, there's this like slow to speak, quick to listen, right? Yeah. And Twitter is in some sense, like quick to speak, slow to listen. It's the proverbial opposite of that. But to bring it kind of back around, I think the value of what somebody like Rogan is doing in long form conversational podcasts is that he's giving space to do what Twitter is not going to be able to do. He's taking on sometimes. Sometimes he's not. My general rule with him is if he's interviewing a comedian, I'm not going to listen to it.
Probably safe.
But if he's interviewing someone of substance, like a politician, or even if it's Kanye West, who he had on recently, who supports expository preaching, from what we heard in the podcast.
Maybe making a monastery.
Alternative community with hydroelectric power and no solar panels, because
hey, you can't tell me that's not interesting.
It's certainly interesting, and that's the point, right? Like, one of the things that you see from Rogan's interview with Kanye is he doesn't spend a lot of time like openly disagreeing with it. It doesn't turn into a debate, even though I'm sure there are things that Kanye thinks, like, he was very clear in that whole interview that he's a Christian. Yeah. Joe Rogan's not. Joe Rogan could have argued with him and pressed him on that. Like, why are you saying God took your mother away from you? That's horrible. God didn't do that. Yeah. But he empathized with the point that Kanye was making, and he tried to understand why this person believes what they believe. Yeah. And most of all, he gave space to it. Yeah.
And a quick note on that. I've actually thought quite a bit about how Joe Rogan's podcast is a pretty good model. I think the TGC article was getting at this, for how to have evangelistic conversations with people. Yeah. Because again, so many times people, especially Christians, will enter into conversations about worldview or about, their faith, and maybe trying to share the gospel with someone who's never heard it. And they feel that they need to just get right to the point. They sort of like, all social cues are out the door, and it's just, let's just do this. And there's a place for bold evangelization and sharing the gospel, but I think there's also something really good about recognizing the value in Joe Rogan's demeanor, his tone, his approach. Assuming, let's say you have someone over to your house, you're showing them hospitality, and you want to engage with them on a meaningful level. Well, how do you do that? Well, take an interest in them. Ask them good questions. Right. Don't beat them over their head when they disagree with you. Yeah. But point out those things that you disagree with, and that's another thing that Rogan will do.
No, he's not ashamed or afraid to disagree with someone. It's just, I think, and we shouldn't be either, absolutely. And so, what we don't want to advocate is, like you said, a kind of like, your truth is your truth. And that's not, what's interesting is, even though he's not a Christian, that's not entirely what Rogan does either. He really does seem to want to get at the truth. And so he's not unwilling to tell someone, I don't know, I'm not sure if I agree with that. But he does it in a very, like you said, a way that shows that what he's after isn't an agenda. It's just to get at the truth, and he wants to give that person the ability to to flesh out what they're saying, but he also wants to bring up legitimate disagreements that people might have with something that they're saying, and he wants to do that because he maybe disagrees, or he wants to do that because he wants to see what they have to say about it, to see if their ideas stand up under scrutiny. It's why free speech is important as a concept. It's the idea that we want to give people the space to see if their ideas stand up to the scrutiny of the truth. And that's, I think, what we want to do with this. But obviously, unlike Rogan, we have an explicitly Christian worldview. The topics that we're going to be interested in, the things we want to talk about, the difficult ideas we want to address, the people we want to hopefully interview, Lord willing, are not going to be people that are going to be in the same vein as people he's interested in. The ideas are not going to necessarily be. There might be some crossover philosophically or politically, just because life is life. But I think our hope is that this can be a sort of long form conversational podcast that allows us to flesh out ideas, but to do so in a way that is deeply committed to the taking every thought captive to Christ, as Paul commands in Corinthians. The Corinthians. This idea that we have an explicitly Christian worldview. We shouldn't be caught up in, to look to what Paul says in Colossians, one ideology, one philosophy, one way of thinking or another. But we, above all people, should be free from the captivity of the constraints that the world puts on us. And we should be able to stand above and beyond that and say, no, this is what it means to think like a Christian about these topics. And it doesn't mean we don't come to some conclusions that are, principled and theological and ideological, and it's not a rejection of theology. That we want to articulate what we think about topics and say, here's why this particular theology is right or this one's wrong. But the idea is, whether we talk about theology, whether we talk about the Bible, whether we talk about practical theology, like what does it look like to live the Christian life? Politics, philosophy. I think we want to, in a similar vein, we want to give truth its day, and we want to be a place in a space where we can interact with ideas and not jump to conclusions, not make assumptions. And that's big. It's hard to do. We have to. It requires humility more than anything else, because it requires that we have to be able to say, we haven't got it entirely figured out, but the Bible gives us the tools to analyze ideas and to come to conclusions about the validity of those ideas. And
I think hopefully this will be a forum where we can together, and maybe if anyone ever ends up listening to this,
way to give us a fighting chance.
There it is. I think this will be a forum for us to learn to, exactly what you're saying, flesh out our thoughts in a way that's, the reality is, being a Christian is not a sort of silver bullet. You learn the gospel and then all of a sudden you figured out life. Like, it takes meditation, it takes deep thought, and understanding, okay, how does Scripture apply in any given circumstance? There's a lot of wisdom required to live out the Christian life. And just spending some time with the Lord, say in the morning, with a quiet time or something like that, that's a helpful thing. But we as Christians, especially given the polarization of today and how secular of a world we live in, we need to know, how do you actually live as a Christian? Well, I hopefully a podcast like this will help us just to think through, okay, what does it mean to live politically as a Christian, or what does it mean to look for even something like a good church or something. There's so many different topics we can touch on. But I think the long form aspect of this podcast is, it's intentional and it's necessary. It's necessary because I think you don't begin to
to wrestle properly with big ideas, difficult ideas, nuanced ideas without giving them time.
Yeah.
Like, we are a people who are obsessed with efficiency. We want to get where we're going. We want to get there now. And when we're talking about taking every thought captive to Christ, that's not always a simple and quick thing. And we can't even begin to, sometimes it takes an hour to even begin to understand what someone's saying before we can even formulate an opinion about what's wrong with what they're talking about. So yeah, I do think the length is a necessary thing, and it's a thing that we want to push back a little bit on the culture and say, and even within Christian culture, and say, look, it's going to take time. Like, you've got to put time and effort into hashing out an idea, or understanding something, even if it's opening up your Bible and saying, what is this text saying to me? Like, that you're not going to come to that conclusion of the truth of what that's saying by reading it once and closing it and giving it a thought for about 5 minutes. Like, no, some passages are going to be easier than others, and then there's bigger questions about how you put the Bible together, and bigger theological issues that you think through. But in general, like, to do the Christian life requires you to be willing to be somebody who puts effort into the life of the mind. Yep. And I think even what I hope this accomplishes even more than that is, yes, I want us to encourage people to give space to thinking well and sort of thinking Christianly about topics, but also just a model of how to discourse. Yeah. Because that's the whole thing about Twitter. It's just a terrible example of discourse. And
it's definitely true.
And what I wanted people to be able to learn how to do is, how do I dialogue with people I disagree with? Or to put it another way, I think the goal in my mind of whatever it is we're talking about in the course of this, Lord willing, is that we learn to think and speak with wisdom and with virtue, and to embody people who recognize that we have been given minds, and we've been given ears, and we've been given mouths. We've been given the process of speech and communication by God to accomplish a purpose that is honoring to Him, that is glorifying to Him, that builds up the body of Christ, that doesn't tear it down. Yeah. That all of these things are to be done for the sake of His glory and for His honor. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about the intention of what we're trying to do here. Ultimately, it's to deal with ideas in a way that's virtuous and honoring to the Lord. So
I'm hearing you use the word virtuous.
Yeah.
Virtue.
Yeah.
How does that relate to the name of our podcast?
Well, I'm glad you asked. You caught me. Yeah. So I think there's a tie-in to everything that we've been saying in the name that we decided on. And when the name we chose was consent to being. And it's a concept.
Being what?
To being. Just being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Consent to being.
Yeah, like existence.
Okay.
Being as in existence. It's a concept that we decided on. It's a concept that comes from the Puritan. Well, some people would debate Puritan, whether or not that's an appropriate title, but Jonathan Edwards, America's sort of preeminent theologian.
I would say the last great Puritan.
The last great Puritan. It comes from one of Edwards' works, the work as The Nature of True Virtue. So it's a companion piece it was published along with another piece called The End for Which God Created the World. So those two were published together and sort of meant to work together as a resource in which Edwards, in The Nature or The End for Which God Created the World, he's kind of arguing that the motivating factor in God's decision to create is that God created a world in which He could display His glory, and therefore the sort of driving factor behind all of creation and everything that happens. The engine of creation is the glory of God, or to think of the way Calvin talked about it, like creation is the theater of the glory of God. Yeah. So Edwards similarly argues that. And then in The Nature of True Virtue, he's doing a few things. He's trying to counteract some of the secular ethics that are prevalent in his day. And by secular, I think maybe it'd be a little more appropriate to talk about it as like some of the deistic type ethics and some of the ethical things that people were posing as sort of, this is the heart of ethics and this is what makes an action ethical or virtuous. And what Edwards is trying to do in that book is give a sort of answer to that question, like, what is the heart of virtue? Like, what defines virtue? And how do we know that something is virtuous or not? And his contemporaries, Christian or not, had all kinds of answers to that question. Selflessness is a sort of very Kantian idea of virtue being, that duty, commitment to duty. But for Edwards, he being a Calvinist pastor and a Christian who thought very differently than some of his contemporaries about the topic, and what he tried to do in that book is speak about the topic in a way that could be that he was conversant with his contemporaries, but also still root the concept ultimately in biblical truth, in much the same way that what we're trying to do is be conversant, but also be explicitly Christian in what we're thinking.
Okay. So you're saying, in the end for which God created the world, Edwards argues that end is God's glory. God created the world for his glory. And then the nature of true virtue, which Edwards defines as consent to being. Yeah, you're jumping ahead of me a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so to get to that, or maybe you're trying to urge me along, but the conclusion that Edwards comes to in The Nature of True Virtue is that virtue most essentially consists in the propensity of one's heart and mind and actions to be aiming at a sort of what he calls a consent to being or benevolence to being in general. And what Edwards means by that, as he fleshes all of it out, is that for an action to be truly virtuous, or for a predisposition of someone's heart, which is ultimately what makes the action happen, for that to be truly virtuous, then the person who acts and the motivation behind their act must be rooted in a love for being in general, which means ultimately, in Edwards, a love for God and a love for the whole system of universal existence that God has put in place. Yeah. So in that sense, the nature of true virtue is Edwards' way of trying to help us understand how we fit into this world that God's created for his glory. Yes. Yeah, and to say we want to be with that aim. Yeah. Like, if God created the world for his glory and everything is working for that end, then virtue is following that end. Yeah. And that's why he uses the concept of consent, because he's saying you are voluntarily choosing and happily choosing and even lovingly choosing to go along with being or go along with the whole system of existence that God has put in place. And of course, Edwards is not saying, as I think you'd be very clear if you read the rest of his works, that's just someday you wake up and you decide, I'm just going to choose to be, to follow the grain of existence as God defines it. I mean, for Edwards, that's a very evangelical thing. The fact that you could get to a point and say, I love God and I love everything that God does and I love the creation that God has made, and I want to cooperate with God in what God's doing every single day in every way I can. Yeah. That doesn't happen apart from regeneration. Yeah. In Edwards. That doesn't happen apart from a change wrought in you by the Holy Spirit. But when that change occurs, for us to talk about something as virtuous, whether it's speech or actions or any thoughts we have, Edwards would say, unless
it is ultimately driven by a desire to participate in God's great aim of creation, which is his glory, then whatever we want to say about our actions, they're not virtuous unless they are ultimately founded on that. So that, the example he gives is that we might think it's, virtuous just to say, well, loving people. Yeah. But he wants to sort of distinguish and say, well, it depends on what you mean by loving people. Loving people can be virtuous if the reason you love them is ultimately pouring out of and flowing from your love for being in general, or God as the being behind beings, is what he says. But if your love for them is simply, as he describes it, a sort of love of complacency, like I get something out of this relationship, it makes me feel good, therefore I love them, then Edwards would say that's not only not virtuous, it's like the opposite of virtue. Yeah. It's a private kind of interest that you have and it is quite contrary to being in general, because you're apt to choose that thing over and against being in general, which means, like, to put that into a real life example, say I love my wife, and most people would say that's a virtuous thing to love your wife. Yeah. The Bible commands us to do that. But for Edwards, if I love my wife simply because of her physical beauty or even her mind, I find her mind stimulating and interesting, or I love her for what she does for me, maybe she serves me in some particular way. Yeah. But if my love for her is ultimately stemming from that, then it's a very self-directed, self-centered kind of love. Whereas a love of benevolence, he's sort of the counter to that, is the idea that you love because you want to see that person sort of joined in with that whole process of being. Yeah. Which means you love them in a way that causes you to serve them and to want to give of yourself to them, because you ultimately want to see them be part of that whole process of the glory of God and being in general, which is going to work itself out in all kinds of ways. Yeah. Probably for most Christians, it's going to be discipleship. It's going to move us to disciple others because we want to see them glorify God. And so discipleship is virtuous for Edwards. It's one of the highest virtues that you can pursue. But say I just love my wife and maybe even I love her, I want to do her good, but I don't necessarily, that love isn't stemming from my love for God and from being in general, so much so that that if given the choice, I would let everyone else die if it meant my wife would be alive. Yeah. Or even maybe on a smaller level, like I'd be willing to do some evil for the sake of my wife. Yeah. Then Edwards would say, obviously we would say that's not virtuous. Yeah. And it's not, because ultimately what makes any love or action virtuous is that general consent or benevolence towards being in general, or towards God's universal system of existence, because it's God who set these things in motion. It's God who governs these things. It's God's providence in all these things. Yeah.
And you can see the way that Edwards is thinking there in 1 John, the way that John defines love. He says, in this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son to be the propitiation for our sins. Yeah. So there's this, this selflessness to love, right, the giving of oneself for the sake of the good of the other, yeah, that ultimately brings them to God. Right. Yeah. Or
in that same vein of, in this, the love of God is perfected in us, and that we love one another the way he has loved us. Jesus says, how will you know that, how will they know that you're my disciples? By the way you love one another. The new commandment I give to you, love one another as I have loved you. Well, the example over and over again that's given in Scripture of what is the nature of the love of which Christ has loved us. Well, it's that love of benevolence. Like, Christ gets nothing from us. He doesn't love us because of our beauty. Yeah. He doesn't love us because of the return he receives. He loves us because it does us good, and it does us a kind of good that's bigger than just, hey, you don't have to go to hell. It's a kind of ultimate good, because by loving us in the way that he does, we get to participate in the whole process of glorifying God. We are blessed, yeah, in the sense that not that we are given nice things or a privileged life or even heaven. We're blessed because we now get to if you look at the way he describes it in John 17, we are one with him in the way that he is one with the Father. Like, we want to glorify the Father in the same way that he wants to glorify the Father. And that's the most blessed thing that he could do for us, is to put us in that position where we can be most virtuous and to love God in the way that he intends for us to love him. And Edwards would say that Christ is the most, his life and death and resurrection on our behalf, his penal substitution on our behalf, it is the utmost of virtuous action, because he redeems us and makes us beautiful, but more so brings us into that whole process of glorifying God.
And I'll just note on that as well, Christ was not disinterested in the way that he loved us.
No,
because it was for the joy set before him. So literally, there's a joy in Christ giving of himself for our good, that he delights to do us good, and which leads to his glory ultimately. And that's an important aspect of this as well, because I remember when I first became a Christian, I really misunderstood Christianity, and I assumed that virtue was that which you didn't really want to do, but you knew was the right thing to do. Right? So it's like just, it's my duty. I have to hold my bootstraps and help all these people and just try to get there. But the reality is, it's actually not virtuous unless you consent in a way that is, no, it's not just, okay, I'll do it sort of begrudgingly, but it's I actually am changed to the degree that I love to love people in this way. I love to love God in this way. That there's an eagerness about it.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. You can't define it as duty in that way, or think of it as just simply something. Like, for Edwards, it doesn't matter how ostensibly good the thing is that you're doing, if it's not flowing from this love of being in general, by which he means a kind of cherishing of existence. And you cherish existence not because it's this sort of carpe diem, c'est la vie. It's not like that. It's, you cherish existence because God has given it to you, and God is good, and you live. It's a very sort of Ecclesiastes kind of way of living, because it's a recognition life's hard, but God has made me and he's given me a lot in life, and I'm going to just stop trying to, buck up against that lot, and I'm going to go with it. And I'm going to live the life that God has given me, and ask that God give me joy in that. And I will obey God and keep his commandments. And for Edwards, that is what life's about. That's what makes life good and virtuous and worth living. And any person who seeks to live in that way not only lives virtuously, but I think the two are obviously interconnected, but lives wisely. And to talk about how Ecclesiastes, it's wisdom literature. It's trying to teach us how to live well within God's world. And we do that ultimately by fearing God, and obeying his commandments. But for Edwards, it's that fear of God, that recognition that God is God, we are not, and he's created this whole system, and it's his, and he's governing it, and he's governing it in good ways, and we just get to be a part of that. And that's to be happy about that, again, which takes the work of the Holy Spirit, because by nature, we are not happy about that. We are against that. But if we are happy about it, then and we go along with it, then our lives are not only blessed but virtuous. So he, just trying to find something. So he talks about, So this is the main, just to quote him directly from this. So. When we are inquiring concerning the nature of true virtue, wherein this true and general beauty of heart does most essentially consist, this is my answer. True virtue most essentially consists in benevolence to being in general, or perhaps to speak more accurately, it is that consent, propensity, and union of heart to being in general, which is immediately exercised in a general goodwill. So the idea is that we, he uses these other terms, union of heart, goodwill, we love existence as it's defined by God.
Yeah.
And we want to be a part of that. We want to join God, and we want to follow the way that God has set forward. And it's the kind of heart that's expressed through Psalm 119, right? Like, I love your way, God. Your precepts are good. I want to follow them. But it's an honest recognition too, like the psalmist in Psalm 119. I don't always want to do that, but I want to do that. Yeah. And so I think to bring that back, one of the reasons that we saw that as a good name and to talk about, what we're doing, is that our hope is that we can address these topics not with fear or with an agenda, but with a kind of joy in life that says there's truth there's truth to be found, and there's virtue, there's a way to act and a way to think and a way to behave, even when it comes to talking through difficult issues. Yep. That's either going to reflect that kind of virtue or it's going to not. Yeah.
And there's an implication to consent to being that, we are creatures, that we have there's someone behind being that we are consenting to, right? And we recognize that, hey, we're, like you're saying, we're part of this greater system, and we are beneficiaries of the goodness of God in this, even as we seek to understand the world that we've been placed into.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, if anything, it's a concept that I think is valuable for understanding how to live the Christian life. And I think Edwards is right. And I don't think it's just that, we've hit on this a little bit. I don't think it's just valuable because it sounds good rationally or philosophically. I mean, it's bared out biblically, like we've shown, and there's so many different ways in which we talk about that and talk about, like, we are created in Christ Jesus for good works. Like, we're not just saved so that we can enjoy the benefits of salvation and just be sort of content and not do anything about that. Yeah. There's a kind of aspect to the Christian life that is crucial to what Edwards is talking about, in which we've been saved because we are now the kind of people who can be happy with God, happy in God, and happy with the world that God has created and the world that God creates every day. We can wake up and say, this is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. Yeah. And that's that kind of motivating us in the way we speak, in the way we talk, in the way we love others, and the way we give to others, and the way we seek their good, because we want to bring them into that. Like, we want that joy that's in us for being to be joy that we see made in others. It's what motivated Paul, to write to the Philippians. You see this refrain over and over again in chapter 1, like, I rejoice, I rejoice, I rejoice. He's happy. He's happy in God. He's happy at what God is doing in his life, even though, from the outward appearance of things, Paul's in prison. He may very well die, and that's a very distinct possibility for him. Yeah. This church that he's planted is being persecuted, and he's writing to them, and he's saying, look, I want you to know that what has happened really is serving to advance the gospel, and I'm happy about that, and I'm happy if I die, and I'm happy no matter what happens, because ultimately I know that whether I live or die, Christ will be glorified in my body, right? And so it's that
I rejoice.
And in that I rejoice. It's that you see that embodied in Paul there. Like, he has a joy for being, because he knows that no matter what happened, the God behind being will get his glory out of whatever happens in Paul's life. Yeah. And so it's no surprise then that Paul's motivation for that leads him to say, but I think I'm going to stick around for a while, because I want to see you. I want to see you built up, and I want to see this. I want to see you, Philippians, be a part of this. And so whether I live or die, like, I want to hear that you're standing firm. I want to hear that you're standing for the gospel. And then going on into chapter 2, I want to not just hear that you're standing firm in the gospel, but I want to see that you are pouring yourselves out for each other.
Yeah.
So it's that same kind of make my joy complete.
Yeah.
And what makes his joy complete? When I see you filled up in Christ, happy in him, if there's any participation in the Spirit, any consolation in love, all these things, if you have that in Christ and you're full in Christ and I've poured myself out for your sake, then make me the utmost happy that I can be to see you pouring yourselves out for each other, and do not think not thinking yourselves more significant than anyone else, but like Christ, emptying yourselves for the good of others.
Yeah, and you see, even as Paul is doing all of this for the Philippians, there's this resignation to God and himself. As you even read the beginning of his letters, he defines himself as a servant of God, or apostle of Christ. That right. he has so consented to being, in that sense, that his self-identity and self-perception was completely wrapped around his relation to God,
right,
and his service to him.
Yeah, and so it ought to be this kind of thing that we ought to be the kind of people who can approach everything not just with the desire to make everything captive to Christ, as Paul says, but to do so in ways that show we are ultimately secure, we're happy people who are happy with what God has done, and there ought to be joy that's expressed in the way that we talk about difficult topics, and that we don't think, everything is riding on this, and we gotta get this right, and if we don't, horrible things are gonna happen. This is not to minimize seriousness in the face of error. Obviously, Paul can be very serious in the face of error, but seriousness isn't in the face of error isn't the same thing as what Paul commands Timothy. Like when it comes to God's servant must not be quarrelsome, but able to treat your enemies. This idea of treating your enemies with compassion, with kindness, with gentleness, and hoping that compassion and that kindness and that gentleness will be what leads them to repentance or leads them to change their mind. Yeah. And I think that's what we, I don't, my goal isn't to sit here and think maybe people will listen to something we say and they'll change their mind. Maybe. Lord willing, that would be great if we're talking about a particular topic and we fleshed it out in such a way that someone thought, I hadn't thought about it that way and I really should think about it differently. Yeah. I hope that happens occasionally. I hope that happens with us. I hope while we're thinking through issues and talking through them that we have a willingness and a humility to both not be taken captive to bad ideas, but also be willing to know why they're bad. Yeah. And that's important, because if we don't know what we believe first, and then know what the other opposing ideology or opposing concept is that goes against that, or the idea that we're trying to combat, then we're not going to, if we don't have those two things down, we're not going to be able to dialogue with that idea in a way that's useful for anybody. Yeah. And so much of the way that difficult ideas, whether they're true or not, or whether they're dangerous or not, even in the Christian world, on Christian Twitter or on social media, whether it's talking about practical theology or biblical theology or systematic theology, concepts that come up that spark controversy, we want to be able to say, okay, what does the Bible say? What are you saying? What are you really saying? And then, okay, now let's try to see how we can address what's being said here. Is it true? What's true about it? What's not true about it? What's useful in it? What's not useful in it? And then we can engage with it and be able to do that well without just sort of being reactionary.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is a charitable way of hearing other people, of listening. Yeah. You want to not just create a caricature of another side that you disagree with, but you actually want to listen, and honestly listen in such a way that you are willing to concede your your perspective, if you are shown, or you come to the place of understanding that Scripture is on the side of this other side, right? If you talk through something to the point where you come to the place, listen, everything is going to be referenced against Scripture. If the weight of the argument is not on our side as we think through it, well, okay, humility dictates a willingness to concede at certain points as well. And that's, again, hopefully this is not simply a place where we, prove all of the things we already thought in the first place, right? but just a place where dialogue can happen, and we can genuinely think through things maybe we haven't settled on yet, but potentially come to conclusions, or potentially just try to think better, more biblically about given, maybe opposing arguments.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, it kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever seen, to reference our second internet famous celebrity of the podcast. Have you ever seen Steven Crowder? He does that Change My Mind segment. So some of those, like, they'll do the edited version where it's, mostly just to mock people, and those aren't typically that useful, but
interestingly, it seems to be against the point.
Yeah, it does seem to be a little bit against the whole point of the thing. Yeah. But you have the long form segment where he'll show you a full conversation. Yeah. And those are fascinating. Like, you don't see that often in our culture.
That was a pretty novel thing when it first came out.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why it went viral to begin with. It was just this,
it's all, you've got a meme about it.
It's a meme, yeah, exactly. But no one does that.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, whatever the topic is, it's very rare that folks just sit here and say, "Okay, here's my position. Let's." It's not quite a. I mean, it's a little bit of a debate, but it's interesting because he frames it as like, you give me your best argument against what I'm saying, and I'll listen to it, and I will sort of do my best to try to understand what you're saying, but then still maintain my position. Yeah. But there's just it's the long form aspect of it. It's the fact that we're going to sit here, we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to let you make your case. Yeah. And I'm going to try with honesty to understand what you're saying. And I think that's what's missing, because you read so many responses to things that people say, and you just want to go, what are you talking about? You're not even trying to understand what the person's saying. And I can say that when I disagree with somebody. I mean, there's things I've read online that I've gone, I disagree with this article, and then I'll read the comments and I'll be like, you don't even understand what the person's saying or why it's actually wrong. Yeah. And that's what I want to be able to do. It's not that I don't want us to. Obviously, we're going to come to some conclusions that some things are wrong, and some ideas. We're not postmodernists by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. There is truth and there is not truth. Yeah. But to get to that, to let truth have its day, you're going to have to endure untruth sometimes. Yeah. You're going to have to listen to it. You're going to have to understand its complexity.
Well, think about how strange of a cultural moment that we live in, that something like the Change My Mind with Crowder becomes viral. Yeah. And essentially he's saying, hey, let's have a discussion. Yeah. And that's so crazy that...
Well, it's the same thing. It's crazy that a guy who's a comedian who is a jiu-jitsu champion, MFA or whatever it is. MMA. Yeah. I lost my man card there. MMA announcer is the most popular. I mean, so much so that he suggests hosting a presidential debate, and one of the candidates says it's a good idea, and he says, "Yeah, I would do that."
Yep. We actually. So he is sort of leading our culture out in political discourse and discourse in general.
Period. Yeah.
While at the same time, the former host of The Apprentice leads the nation. It's a wonderful.
Which is an interesting contrast, because you talk about discourse. Someone who's not. Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. But it is interesting because. The fact that we're so hungry for discourse that people are willing to listen to somebody like Rogan
3 hours
for 3 hours. Yeah. For 3 hours, but regardless of, and the thing is funny is that he's not, he'll tell you I'm not a smart guy. I just want to hear what people have to say.
Yeah.
And but there's a value to that that's so missing. Yeah. And I think that's what, at least from a Christian perspective, we're not trying to emulate what he's doing, but we are trying to say, Christians, why are we not discoursing?
This used to be a thing.
Yeah, and why are we taking to Twitter to hash out ideas that are vastly difficult and complicated and especially theology? I mean, the fact that we think we could do theology well on social media and on Twitter, when the way we typically have done theology in the past is writing voluminous compendiums of books that you have to read before you can understand someone's position, and then write a whole book in response to that position.
Yeah.
And I think that's still probably the best way to do it.
Well, it's interesting, just as a little side note, people have speculated, Joe Rogan being one of them, and Jordan Peterson being another one, that there's something to, podcasts and YouTube, what they call the new media, that seems to imitate the Gutenberg press.
Oh, right.
There's this new medium.
Explosion.
Yeah, it's a new medium for interaction, for conversation, for discourse, like you're saying. So whereas, it may not be as effective as writing a book, I think it's certainly more accessible.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, obviously writing a book is going to be more, it's going to allow you to really get into the nitty gritty, and print is, I don't think you can beat print for being able to understand an argument.
I've heard Peterson describe the difference between like a podcast and a book as the difference between, a picture and a painting, or like something you snap on your phone.
Yeah.
Right. You can get information from that, but there's a difference with a painting where there's layered information. There's intent. There's well thought out detail. Yeah,
and I think both are necessary. But like you said, I do think the value of. I think being able to do discourse well requires that you, first of all, probably need to be someone who's willing to go read.
Yeah.
And I think those two things are intimately related, because reading will teach you how to understand an argument, and how to think through it, and then how to respond to it.
Yeah.
But discourse, is its own whole discipline, and at least in terms of what you're saying, yes, it's more accessible. And so, especially in our culture, like, we're not apt to spend a lot of time just sitting there. And in some sense you could say, like, one of the things that discourse what this kind of thing replaces is it's like people probably spent a lot more time back in the day sitting in a parlor having a serious conversation.
Yeah.
So, that's why you had a parlor, because that's what it was for. That's even what the name implies.
Yeah.
And it's a place where you sit and talk. And I don't think back a long time ago that it was primarily people just sitting around talking about nothing. I think if you ever been around like older folks, you can see that they have a tendency to do this thing where they'll get into like difficult ideas in conversation, just sitting around. Like at a family reunion, you might see two old guys. I saw this at I went to someone's like a 4th of July party that somebody had, and they had their grandfather and their great grandfather, and they were sitting there and they hadn't seen each other all year, and they were talking about like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Kant, and they were having this huge like political or philosophical discussion. And everybody around them did not have the time for it. They were like, what are these guys doing? We don't know what's happening here. We just sort of let them do their own thing.
Wow.
But I think, there was a it's not, I don't think it's new in the sense that like people haven't done it. I think it's new in the sense that it's just not done as often because we are in this very like fast-paced culture where we don't make time to sit and talk, and we don't make time to, you know, even in the Christian culture, I find that like you'll have like, oh, let's get together for an hour and let's talk about this thing. You know, let's do a Bible study for an hour. And you know, I get that not every Bible study can be 2 or 3 hours long, but I'll go sometimes to something like that, and it's like, okay, we're going to get together for an hour and talk about this. And like about an hour in, I'm like, all right, we're getting going now. And all right, it's time to go. And I'm like, no. Like this is, we finally got the gas going. And so,
well, to that point actually makes it confusing why, you know, long form podcasts are attractive to people, because that's true. I mean, like our culture is very fast paced. It's very much, you know, get it done in an hour, get it done in 30 minutes, you know, get those blocks of time. Then all of a sudden, you know, someone wants to record themselves for 3 hours and talk about, you know, these high level ideas.
Well, I think it's
somehow become, you know, interesting to listen to.
I think on the one hand, like we are starved for it. So we know we need some, we know, and I mean, just turn on the news, turn on the media, turn on, you know, the political discourse. I mean, that's just, everybody's starving for substantive.
Well, maybe that's the thing. It's the substance that, you know.
Yeah, it's the substance. But I think, but it's still, it's like we want the substance, but we don't know how to make the room for it. And so one of the things that podcasts, I think, have done, especially as they've gotten longer form, because there's podcasts that are fit perfectly into that format of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 45. You know, leading up to this was reading all kinds of material about how you can't make a podcast that's longer than 25 minutes. That's the perfect commute time. And you want to just...
Well, we're already past that.
We're already past that.
Sorry, guys.
But the point of... a point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that you can listen to podcasts while you can still listen to podcasts while you're doing other things, which is what makes them accessible. So you can get the substance without having to sit down and focus on an article or a book. You can do it while you're working out. You can do it while you're working, especially in today's, you know, COVID world where folks are trapped at home and, you know, are just working through Excel documents, and instead of listening to music, maybe they're listening to a podcast, and so they're hearing a substantive dialogue while doing their job. I mean, I do that. Maybe it's just traveling, different kinds of things. And so it's, or, you know, it's sort of on demand in some sense. Like, hey, I got 2 hours. Maybe instead of watching Netflix, I'll listen to some people have a substantive dialogue. That's kind of,
that's a better use.
Oh, it's so much better, I think. I mean, that's basically where I'm at now, and I'm not trying to sort of look down on anybody who's watching Netflix, but I'm kind of at a point where, like, if I've got free time, I would just feel so much more helped by finding a conversation like that or listening to something like that than popping on, you know, a television show. And I'm not saying there's not, you know, look, art is important too, and art can have substance to it, and there's art out there, there's television shows that will stimulate you and help you to think well about life and are vivid. And so I absolutely am not trying to say don't go, you know, there's no value to watching something on Netflix. I think there's probably not a lot of value to watching most things that are out there. And I think if anything, maybe what I'm saying is like the choice of listening to a podcast or the choice of watching something or the choice of what you watch, it's all about choosing to, again, recognize that there's a virtuous way to be entertained. There's a virtuous way to rest. And we can just separate those things out and just think there's sort of some value to a kind of mindless, mind-numbing, vegetative process. Like if we're a part of this process of God's creation and glorifying God, there are ways we can spend our leisure time that are going to benefit us in a way that makes us able to, that flows in with that desire we have for being in general.
Yeah, it's we've talked about this quite a bit, but it's the kind of rest that is rejuvenating because it's meaningful.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and it's rejuvenating because it's the same way that, like, for me, like, if there are shows that if I do tend to still watch them, it's because over time I've found there's value and meaning in this. Like, there's things that are being said in this show, or this movie or this art form that comports with the Christian life that I find meaningful because it resonates with something that's true about reality, and it highlights it well. And if it doesn't do that, then it is just mindless. Usually it's mindless entertainment. It's mindless things. And there are, that doesn't mean everybody has sat there and thought through, like, is Star Wars Christian? What about Star Wars? It resonates with the Christian life. Some people have, some people haven't. But there's things that are meaningful in art, and there's things that are not. And it's all about, I think what we would probably both agree with is that we're trying to say, we want to encourage people to be discerning with the kinds of things they engage in, and not to try to make it this sort of process that feels difficult and full of effort. But, it's not, that's the whole thing, is it's not difficult or effort for me to listen to a podcast. It is still leisurely, but it is leisurely in a way that I am a passive listener, but I can passively listen and be edified, and
it'll provoke you to thought at points, even if you're passive. And that's that's helpful. Is it ironic that we are doing this podcast? Is that what you say, doing?
I don't know.
Are we doing this podcast? Whatever. We're
podding.
Creating this podcast while talking about podcasts. Like, have you ever watched a TV show that was talking about TV shows in the first episode? Podcast Inception.
No. It kind of reminds me of, like, on Seinfeld, where they did they made Seinfeld on Seinfeld.
Speaking of shows that literally have
seriously,
no connection to anything greater.
And it's very cynical.
The show about nothing.
Yeah, it is ironic, but I mean, I do think,
like, that's weird that this medium you can do that.
Well, I mean, you can do that with other mediums, but I think what it shows is that, again, we're not just doing this because we want to do it.
No.
Like, we're very self-aware of the fact that, there'd be something quite ridiculous if we were like, let's have a podcast because we're smart and we want to talk.
No.
And we think people want to listen to us. Or let's do podcasts so we can make money or get followers, or whatever reasons people are motivated to do podcasts. I imagine there are plenty of people who are just genuinely motivated by the interest in the topic and they want to talk about it. But I think for us it's a recognition of the value of the medium. And seeing it as something that fits into a space that we think is sorely needed in the Christian life, or in the larger discourse of the Christian world.
Well, that's and maybe we haven't hit on that enough. Like, we talk about Rogan quite a bit, but the reality is, I think there are plenty of Christian podcasts, but I don't know that there's a lot of Christian podcasts that are trying to do their podcast in the vein of Rogan. Right?
No,
and there's certainly dialogue. I think of, like, Thinking in Public by Albert.
Yeah.
But what's I think is different from that, and what we're trying to do is, he'll kind of go into the conversation with sort of a set. Maybe they're going to talk about a book. Right. Yeah. That's generally what it is. He's interviewing authors and things like that. And whereas that might be the case for some of our podcasts, it's not necessarily our stated objective to each time we have, a podcast that's going to be centered around these topics, or next week we're going to talk about this. I think it's a little bit more organic because, again, we want to foster more of a kind of discourse through this rather than specifically discoursing on certain things.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that is absolutely key. I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's actually, it's key, because you're right. There are, and I was looking through podcasts, well-known podcasts, and there are excellent Christian podcasts out there.
Absolutely.
Excellent Christian podcasts. I love, I think you would consider Ask Pastor John a podcast. It's a 15-minute podcast. Thinking in Public is really great. I think one of the things that's just great about Thinking in Public is it's similar in that, like, he's going to have non-Christians on. I mean, he had James Lindsay, who's an atheist, to talk about cultural Marxism, and that's an area that Lindsay's well versed in. But and he's going to have a wide range of folks on there.
Yeah.
One of the things that, and it's to talk about some particular thing, and there might be a little bit more focus to what Mohler's doing, and there's a value in that. I don't want to disparage that in any way, shape, or form. But what I think I'm hoping that sets us apart from something like that, beyond the fact that we're could never be nearly the engine of productivity that Al Mohler is.
We didn't even hit on the briefing.
He's in the briefing where you read the news with Al Mohler. I think, like, one of the things I hope that's a little bit different about this is that we give a little bit more space, Lord willing, if we do end up interviewing folks. I mean, we can talk a little bit about our initial goal is just to interview people within our immediate sphere. The dream would be to be able to interview other folks within the evangelicalism who would be people that we'd love to just sit down and have a 2-hour long conversation with, and let that conversation go wherever it needs to go. But early on, I think we're content to talk to people who we know, who are interesting, who we think well, and give that space and just provide a kind of substantial conversation and dialogue for people to be edified by.
And eventually we'll get to the point where it's Christians in cars getting coffee.
No. Well, there's already one of those.
That'll be a spinoff. Cars Coffee Theology.
No, that's already a thing.
It'll just be a spinoff. Fine.
No, you can't do it. It's already happened.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah. We'll do theologians on tricycles with tea.
That works.
All teas.
That actually would work well for me right now.
Yeah, because you're not drinking coffee.
I'm not drinking coffee.
Because you don't like to consent to being.
Listen, that's no.
And the wonderful thing that is coffee that the Lord has made.
Hey, I invite the one listener who's listening to try, just go off coffee for a week, replace it with tea. You don't have to go cold turkey. Just see how you feel. See the difference.
You will get a headache.
And then subscribe.
That's terrible. That was terrible.
Yeah,
you shouldn't. That was terrible. Shameless plug. Don't do anything he just said. Maybe subscribe, but don't.
Shameless plug.
Oh my goodness.
Well, they're probably not listening anymore.
Yeah, that's fine. They were like, this guy's telling me to drink tea, and they're not doing it.
It's a thing. You got it. I mean, listen. Coffee. People are differently sensitive to coffee.
I know.
There's a range.
I know.
I'm on the higher side.
That's what you say.
I'm HSP.
That's what you say.
Highly sensitive person.
You still drinking? Are you still drinking soda?
Yeah, but there's a lot less caffeine.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, soda, I don't know. I'm more like LaCroix these days. Bubbly.
Oh, yeah.
I don't actually discriminate between sparkling water?
Yeah.
What do they call it?
Sparkling water, yeah.
For me, it's just whatever's cheapest.
It's just whatever's cheapest.
Yeah.
I like it. If it's sparkling, if it's got flavor, I'll drink it.
I like that. Brought to you by LaCroix.
I would prefer if it had caffeine, which, have you had AHA?
I have.
Some of them have caffeine in them.
Yes. I don't know how I feel about it, though.
Yep.
Like the tea and citrus one.
Yep.
I'm like, I don't know if this is the right way to drink tea.
It's fine.
Well,
I like it.
Okay.
I think.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Man, what were we talking about? We were talking about podcasts. Yeah. So there's there's good Christian podcasts. But none of them are I think really aiming at the same kind of long form goal that we are. None of them are as free form as maybe we hope to be.
I mean, there
may be some. I think the Happy Rant's somewhat free form, which is Barnabas Piper's podcast. But there's a free formness and a sort of long formness. I mean, and the idea is that like we want to just give the space to think through an idea and not feel constrained by an agenda necessarily. But that's not to say that like we're not going to, bring in a particular thing that we want to talk about and say, let's talk about this. But the goal is ultimately to let that be largely determined by who we're talking to.
Sure.
If somebody that we're talking to has a particular thing that they're known for, or that they're interested in, like we want to follow that rabbit,
sure,
so to speak. I don't know if that's an expression. I think I just made that up.
It is now.
Follow that rabbit. Follow the rabbit. There he goes, down the rabbit trail, which is the actual expression.
That'll be the next podcast.
Follow the rabbit.
Follow the rabbit.
That's we missed it.
Could have been.
Could have been. So much more immediately understandable that we did have to do a whole podcast explaining what follow that rabbit means.
And then it would become part of the culture.
No, probably not.
You never know.
Oh boy. Yeah. So I think in the
go ahead.
In the end, I hope that what we're doing is valuable, and not necessarily, again, not that we're trying to compete with any of those other podcasts. We would say, go listen to Ask Pastor John, go listen to Thinking in Public, go listen to the 9 Marks Pastors Talk, excellent podcast, and then all the other 9 Marks podcasts that they've got spun up right now, like the Preacher's Talk and Bible Talk. All those things are super valuable and useful, but all those are going to be on the shorter end, and that's good. That has its place and its usefulness.
You got 5 minutes in church history.
You got 5 minutes. Yeah, you got 5 or 15, sometimes 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But yeah, we want to just give a little bit more space and a little bit more time to flesh through an idea and to really make it clear, like provide some clarity, because I think, believe it or not, clarity has to be hammered out. You've got to almost sort of imagine it like a sword and a blacksmith, it's got to take its shape, and that's going to take repeated blows, the same thing. And you're getting a little bit more of the shape, and now a little bit more of the shape, and a little bit more of the shape, until it's hammered out. And you can see sort of the progress of the ideas and the thoughts, so that you can really go, okay, I think I really understand. I mean, a great example of that is the Kanye podcast. You listen to that. It was 3 hours of just listening to Kanye
and Joe Rogan.
Mostly Kanye, because Joe just sort of let him do his thing for majority of it.
Absolutely.
But 3 hours of just listening to Kanye speak. And that's quite enlightening, I think, in some sense. So you get a better sense of who he is as a person. There may be some... Particularly
someone running for president.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, and I mean, there's something to be said about, wouldn't it be fantastic if Biden or Trump had to spend 3 hours or 2 hours in front of Joe Rogan?
Well, ironically, that was actually proposed.
No, I know. Yeah, we mentioned that earlier. Yeah, and Trump said he would do it, and Biden probably doesn't. I don't know. He probably doesn't know what a podcast is, but who knows? So it was, I think it'd be really, it's really great to just, and Rogan can can do what he did, which is he said, he was very much willing to say, okay, you want to be president.
Yep.
How did you handle education?
Foreign policy.
And instead of debating with him, like even some of the moderators of some of the debates did for the presidential debates, he just let him say what he had to say.
Yeah.
And take it or leave it.
Yeah.
You got some sense of what Kanye's thoughts are about those things.
Yeah.
Though.
Well, wouldn't that be interesting if that was just the norm in politics, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we'll give you 5 hours tonight. Talk about whatever you want. Talk about whatever issue you want to talk about. Lay it out for us, right?
Yeah.
I think that would really filter out some great people.
Right.
Because you have to be willing,
you have to be
able to communicate on that level for that kind of length.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I think that would be a great upgrade.
Yeah, it would certainly be better than when you talk about political discourse, like whether it's debate formats or even just the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, that's the same. You got 5 minutes with a candidate. Let's talk to them about this. I mean, the example of this I watched, and I'm not going to name names, but I watched a popular newscaster interviewing a senator, and they were asking the senator about why they weren't voting on a particular bill. And they were sort of implying to the person, hey, it seems like you should want to vote on this. Why don't you just go ahead and vote for it? And instead of sort of just responding, okay, well, let me lay out my position against this bill. Yeah. Okay, well, so, yes, here's some good things about this bill, but here's some of the problems with this bill, and let me explain to you why those problems are ultimately make this a bill that I can't vote for.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be wonderful if you could actually hear that from a politician, where they could give you a substantial reason and you could go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I was thinking they were just a monster and they hated everyone. Yeah. Of course, you weren't thinking that, but that's the sort of way we talk. Like, how can this person not vote for this? Yeah. And so instead of doing that, though, instead of giving that person, or instead of that person taking the opportunity to do that, and I think it's partly the format itself, but it's also partly the position we've gotten in when it comes to discourse, that we would just do this. I'm not kidding you. The person responded immediately to the question by saying, I can't believe you are sympathizing with the other side and asking me this. Yeah. They just immediately accused the person asking the question of, how dare you sympathize with the other side by challenging me on this, instead of just saying, yeah, I could see why you would have that question. Let's talk about that. Let's give a fair hearing to that. And let me show you why this is actually, even though this on paper looks like a really great bill, it's really not. And I don't know if it's that we've just gotten so tired of listening to politicians talk and politicians have gotten tired of listening to themselves talk about nothing. Yeah. That they just don't have it in them anymore to do it, or if the discourse has just been accelerated, or, I mean, there's so many factors to it, and so much of it's cultural. I think a lot of it, again, is the medium.
TV is so constrained by airtime. It's so
commercial breaks.
Real estate.
I mean, commercial breaks. Yeah, we got to go to a commercial break.
Absolutely, and
I'm gonna have to cut you off.
Of necessity, you only have a window of time to communicate what you want to say, because again, it costs so dang much to put anything out there. So that's the strange thing again about podcasts and YouTube and all that, because it's this weird sort of backdoor media that's come about that is actually more on demand than television. Yep. And much more accessible, and has the potential to reach a wider audience. Right. And yet it's free. Yeah. It's bizarre. Yeah. But I do think, to your point, the fact that political discourse has gotten so short, quick, and aggressively defensive, what's strange is that there are politics out there who probably could have, long discourse and have very substantive conversations with the American people. But again, because of the medium,
Yeah.
No one sees that, and they're just lumped in with everybody else. I think you would really begin to see, okay, who are the
separated out? Yeah.
Who are the legitimate, servants of the people?
Yeah.
Or versus just people that may have really great sound bites, but nothing behind it.
Yeah. Well, I think. Yeah. There's just so much of the process that we've come to, it's that, like you said, the medium, super important to that. And, you've got this sort of Marshall McLuhan, like the medium is the message. Mm-hmm. And it's that idea that you read about in something like Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, where he sort of predicted, television is going to entertainment defy politics. Mm-hmm. And this was back when television was sort of first on the scene that he wrote this book. Yeah. But his prediction was television as a medium, visual medium, and the way in which it operated and sort of still operates will inherently change the nature of the kinds of things that are communicated on. And if we rely on television to communicate substantial ideas like political ideas, then we are going to be the worse for it, because what's going to happen is those things are going to inherently become rooted in entertainment, not in ideas or principle. And that's exactly what's happened. Yeah, he was just scarily accurate in his prediction on that. Now, Now that's where the internet becomes this sort of strange thing that enters in, because it's like YouTube can both accelerate that problem, because it can both continue to sort of devalue our ability to think by just providing like cat videos nonstop. Yeah. Or it can be this means of, like you said, sort of an alternative long form space in which we actually are able to once again let ideas and let thought be what drives what we're doing. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I think one of the things you'll never probably see us try to do is be entertaining. Yeah. And I don't mean that sort of in a self-deprecating way. I mean, like, we talked about this, like, and again, I'm not trying to knock anybody, but we're not going to have a fancy intro. We're not going to have, at least in terms of like, welcome to the, there's a sort of professionalism and things that there's even in podcasting, there's like, all this things you can read about here's how to make your podcast compelling and entertaining and Yeah. I mean, maybe there's a place for that. But again, I'm not trying to do this because I want to be entertaining or because I want people to listen to what I have to say per se. I want a place where ideas can just have their day. Yeah. And I want to do that as a Christian, because one of the things you do find when you listen to someone like Rogan is like, that's compelling that he'll do that. It's not compelling that, he's coming at it from a worldview that is sometimes just tragically out of step with how things really are. And so it's like you see that he's someone who wants to get at the truth, but can never finally arrive at the end of the day at some of these things.
That has to be exhausting for him, talking to so many people, having some conversations of substance, but really arriving at the same place, just hitting a wall of, religion has some good things, he would say. Yeah. There's certain things that are helpful, but, at the end of the day, he'd get into some weird theories, but never really land.
Yeah. Well, it was part of what initially prompted this was me thinking, boy, I'd love to see like a good theologian on there. Mm-hmm. Someone who really knew what they were talking about. And initially that was because I'd love to see them just explain to him, hey, actually, here's what Christianity is. Here's the gospel. Here's what the Bible says. Let's talk about the Bible. Let's address some of the sort of things that you've said that have been just woefully untrue about the nature of the Christian faith and about the Bible. Yeah. That would be great. I still pray that somebody finds their way on there at some point to do that. Kanye's about as close as we've gotten at this point, because at least Kanye
I had not thought about that.
Oh, he really is. I mean, he's telling him about expository preaching, and he's telling him about, God and the gospel. And yeah. I mean, that's not super in depth, but he was present. He was present, and he said the things that were in his head.
I will say, from a political standpoint, it was interesting to see how much into like pro-life issues that Kanye got.
Yeah,
and honestly, pretty courageously. I was surprised at the length he was willing to go.
Yeah.
To articulate the issue with some of the choice arguments.
Yeah. I wonder if sometimes that's courage, or if it's just sort of part of his MO of kind of doing his own thing.
It's possible.
But I mean, I'm not going to knock him for saying it. I'm grateful that somebody in a position where millions of people are going to hear him is willing to address that topic and to condemn it and to speak about it in a way that is clear-ish and to raise even just the potentially controversial idea of like, hey, if we're concerned about lives with COVID, why aren't we concerned about the lives that are being lost in abortion? I mean, that's a pretty direct question to put in that format. And, he hasn't really gotten any pushback for it. I mean, I haven't seen any pushback from that interview, really. And I don't know if that's just people don't know what to make of him, and or they just kind of leave him alone or what. But I'm grateful that those ideas are having somewhat of again, I'm grateful that somebody is talking about those things, and I hope that it leads to more of that. I mean, I pray that Rogan is fascinated enough by these things that he's willing to find and seek out somebody who knows, because he's the kind of guy who's willing to do that usually. He's willing to go find somebody who knows what they're talking about on a topic and really listen to what they have to say. It doesn't matter if he agrees with it or not. I just don't know if he knows of how to, if he even wanted to, how would he even do that? Who's he going to go talk to? And I've thought about that too. Like, how would that work? But ultimately, whether or not that happens or not, I think our goal is to allow, at least for us, to do something similar, but to elevate the discourse for Christians, whether it's elevate the political discourse, for sure, elevate theological discourse, elevate discourse about biblical interpretation, elevate discourse about the church, elevate discourse period from Christians. Like, we want to speak virtuously and encourage others to do so. So
I mean, it's interesting you bring up political discourse, given that this podcast is starting a week before the election day. That's a time, I mean, right now it's pretty polarizing. I think you can just look out in online Christendom, and you can see a lot of different camps forming, a lot of different thoughts, arguments being made. A couple of people we respect have differed, in their perspective and their approach to this election. I mean, I don't know if did you read Al Mohler's article?
I did. I read Al's article. I didn't get all the way through it, but I read through it to get the gist of most of it. How would you, maybe just for folks who are listening who may or may not have read it, how would you sort of summarize what's the thrust of Al's argument?
I'd say, I don't necessarily know if Al Mohler was writing in response to, say, someone like Piper in his article, but I know that Al Mohler's gotten some maybe pushback, given that in 2016 Al Mohler was pretty convinced about not voting in that election, given some of the character issues of Trump and the policies of Hillary Clinton, being more pro-choice and things like that. And this article, I think, was more of a defense of how Al Mohler's kind of changed his thinking around Trump, particularly, and how he intends to vote for Trump. But the thrust of the article was essentially that, when you assess a candidate for political office, you want to look at them sort of holistically. So when you're assessing character in particular, there are really three sort of arenas in which you're assessing character. There's the personal, there's the policied, and then there's the practical. And his basic argument was that, consider individuals as a whole. Don't necessarily say, hey, because this person's private life,
separating them out,
is questionable, or in some cases just blatantly sinful. That necessarily, out of hand excuses that person or removes that person from consideration.
Right.
He would say that the weight of something like, policies and principles have the potential to sort of in aggregate make it possible to vote for an individual and consider their character in the moral judgments that they're making and their policies, things like that.
Okay.
So it was definitely an interesting article. And again, it might be easier to talk about in relation to Piper's article.
Yeah.
Just seeing that there's a different take on the same issue that may kind of fully color in. So you read that one.
Yep.
How would you describe kind of what Piper was getting at in that?
I think the thrust of his article is definitely different. I mean, he's taking the question about voting, and he's sort of asking, what are the sort of effects what are the paths that both choices are going to lead to?
Okay.
And on the one hand, I think it's obvious that he's willing to say, look, there's a path to destruction on one side, and that's obvious because that path is a path of destruction of policy, where you have bad policies that will undermine our way of life and that will be literally detrimental to the lives of Americans, in the case of a party and a person and a platform that's continuing to advocate for and continue the policies that like abortion and things like that. And so it's the idea of, obviously, one choice is a path to destruction. There's no question about that, for Christians at least. The substance of the main thrust of the article is the other path. Like, what's the other path leading to? Yeah. And if our answer is simply because it's not on a policy level going to head the same direction, is that enough? And I think Piper's answer is no, because you have to look at something like someone's character, and you have to look at the influence of their character as equally destructive, not in the sense that it's equal in that, like, he's not comparing meanness to murder. I think some of the arguments I've heard from people who will contrast it will say, well, Piper's wrong because he's saying meanness is as bad as murder. And that's not what Piper's doing. He's not trying to say meanness and murder are just as bad, and so we should vote against both the guy who's murdering people and the guy who's mean. Yeah. His argument's much more substantial than that, and you got to take it seriously. But what he's actually saying is that the effects of Trump's character, his constant display, and things that even Mohler acknowledges in his articles as offensive, his constant narcissism, his self-centered self-promotion, his just basic way of character, his pugnaciousness, his offensive speech, the things that he's willing to say to people. It's not just meanness. It's it's exactly what we've been talking about. It's a kind of destructive rhetoric that is erosive to the soul of the people that not just hear it, but entertain it. And I think what Piper's trying to say is you can't say that somebody has good policies to sort of counter what Mohler's saying and say that, okay, their policies are good. Yes, I know they spit poison when they speak. And their attitude and their character and their words are corrosive, but they're doing good things. Well, I think Piper's argument is, okay, but ultimately those good things are going to be undermined if we're willing to entertain that kind of character, because what's going to happen is over time, and probably quicker than we think, not only will that character and that attitude lead us to be the very people who cease to care about those things that make us not want things like abortion to happen, but ultimately it will just erode the whole process, so that like we ourselves will just become people who sound and talk like that. And I mean, sadly, I think that it's true. I mean, you see people who, I'm not trying to imply anybody who has supported the president for the last 4 years has done this, or everybody has, but I've certainly seen people who have become more and more willing to turn a blind eye to criticism and to say, not just that, yeah, Trump's got some problems, but, not like what Mohler's trying to do, but people who will get to a point where they'll go, no, there's nothing wrong. He's mean. It's good. It's fine. Yeah. And those people, I think, what Piper's talking about becomes true. There's a sort of corrosive quality to that kind of attitude, and those people can adopt that corrosive quality, and they start speaking like Trump. They start dialoguing and discoursing like Trump. Yeah. And I think this is where you have to understand the substance of Piper's argument. And it's not simply that Piper is saying we can't vote for a sinner. Like that's clearly not what he means. And every president is a sinner, and we can't, and Piper's not just saying, well, Trump's a mean guy, he's a sinner, I can't vote for him. I've heard some Christians say, well, gosh, if we can't vote for a sinner, who are we going to vote for? Yeah. But we can recognize, like, there's a difference between Trump and Reagan. Yeah. Right? Both of them are sinners. Yeah. One can discourse helpfully and with honor and civility. And I think as Christians, that's something like we should be able to recognize, Christian or not. There's a civil way of talking, and then there's a not civil way of talking. Yeah.
And even as you say that, I mean, having this distinct category for Trump in terms of the way that he goes about talking, I think that as Christians, we need to be able to, even if you are choosing to vote for Trump, you need to be able to recognize things that are in clear contrast to Scripture. And those are the kinds of things that I think delegitimize Christians when they treat the conversation as if it's only about, well, I'm not going to vote for the other side. Yeah. Right. Well, okay. Yeah. But that's fine. Hold that position, but just also acknowledge, hey, this isn't like Christ. Yeah. This isn't an angel that we're voting for. There are flaws. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you acknowledge them. And
well, that's one of the things I appreciated about Mohler's argument is that even though I think he comes to the conclusion that he's going to vote for Trump in spite of some of those things. Yeah. He's very clear and critical about those things, and he says these are not good things. And I think he uses terminology that Piper would use as well in his article. Yep. And I think the difference is that for Mohler, at the end of the day, if you ask the question, okay, is the character undermining the policy? And I think for Mohler, his answer seems to be, no. Yeah, not quite. Yeah. I think for Piper, it's a resounding yes. It's because for a few reasons. I think mostly as a pastor, he's looking at the effect that support for Trump, especially the kind, not like Mohler, but the kind that we're talking about, is leading Christians to adopt his behavior.
Yeah.
And because that's what leaders do, they lead. Mm-hmm. They lead people to behave like them. And you start to sort of justify a leader's behavior when you appreciate their policies. You're even more willing to justify their behavior because of their policies you think are good.
Yeah.
And you see this. I think there are people who justify his behavior, and you think, well, you don't like, look, you vote for him or not, like, just don't pretend like some of these things are okay, and don't pretend like it's okay for you to do it.
Yeah. But it's possible to conflate, Trump has gotten things done, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the points that Mohler makes. It's, I think, valid.
But it's what you can conflate is the idea that this was the only way that could have happened.
Right.
And then once you start thinking like that, you start thinking in terms of, okay, well, in certain circumstances, this kind of behavior is warranted.
Yep.
And then suddenly, that's how you start to be influenced by these things.
The ends justify the means kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and so I think that's where it's important to recognize both of these guys are not, I don't think, I'm not trying to say that Mohler's saying the ends justify the means. I think he's trying to make a principled argument that, look, I think you have to take these things as a whole, and you have to say that, if charitably, I think I read what Mohler is saying as whatever Trump does in his discourse and whatever he's done in his character, there's something about his character that's not on the whole bad if he's been willing to do these things and follow through with them.
Yeah.
If I understand essentially what he's saying.
Yep.
And I get that. And I think
because he would say that the policies that Trump has made and his consistency in those things, like you're mentioning, indicates a moral judgment. So there's morality behind it.
Yes.
There's character behind it. And again, because he's followed through.
Yeah.
Consistently.
And that's important. Like, I think again, for Christians who are wrestling with this question, it's not a helpful thing if you're thinking you don't want to vote for him to do the opposite of the same thing that we're just talking about and say he's done nothing of value.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's drawn out by that article, and one of the things we have to be willing to say, is that I certainly think between 2016 and now, I can understand where Mohler's coming from, because in 2016, Trump was a wild card.
Yeah.
I mean, he was like obvious character problems.
Yeah.
And especially when that tape came out, it was like, whoa, we are seriously going to vote for this guy? And like, are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. And no one knows, like, is he actually going to follow through with what he's saying? What is even his policy positions? He's not even made clear what those things are.
And positions that he has, in 2016 were different than ones he had held prior to 2016.
Yeah. And even when given the opportunity to, going back to the sort of limitations of the whole process of political discourse, when asked about those things, it was like, you watch those debates and it was basically, he was just making fun of everybody else. Yeah. So I guess there were some people who felt like a change was needed, that they were willing to take a bet and vote on him. But for me, man, I was just looking at that going, there is just no justification for voting for someone like this, because I don't trust him. Yeah. I didn't trust that he meant what he had to say. I didn't trust that, here's a guy who just seems like he's riding high on populist sentiment. And maybe that's, to maybe disagree with Mohler a little bit. Maybe what we see is not principle. Maybe it's still someone who's just, again, riding high on populist sentiment and who's willing to follow through with it to maintain that and to get reelected. Who knows? Yeah. I don't know. I can't make that judgment because I don't see into the heart and mind of Donald Trump, so I can't make that assessment.
Yeah.
But back then, I certainly think that it was like there was just no good reason for it in my mind to do it then. I see where Mohler's coming from now, in that, like, obviously you look back.
You have a track record.
You have a track record now. And he's been pretty good in terms of following through with some of the things he said he's going to do. Some of the things that he hasn't been as good about, I don't care. Yes, there's not a wall built up, but depending on where you stand on that issue, he's built some aspects of the wall. That wasn't a big selling point for me, but
yeah.
I think more so you look at like the broader things that Republicans are concerned about, and he's been pretty good about, 3 conservative Supreme Court justices. That's pretty good. Yeah. And he nominated people that were pretty conservative, and Amy Barrett is an originalist. I mean, she's sort of I couldn't imagine a better fit, even if it didn't matter who would be president. That's the person that I think most people would have thought would be a good choice for a Republican president. So
sure,
there are good things, and there are good things that he's accomplished. I mean, heck, man, no new wars, that's a big one, and not getting us involved in more conflict around the world, and seemingly brokering some peace, actually, peace treaties in the Middle East. I mean, yep. To the degree where you're almost kind of like, okay, maybe changed my eschatology here. This is getting a little Antichrist-like, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we do ourselves any favors to just pretend like all Trump has done for 4 years is just divide people and be mean and not accomplish anything. Yeah. I think
at the same time, there's certainly been, again, because of some of his tone, there's been more division. Not necessarily, yeah. He's not necessarily the cause of it, but he certainly hasn't helped it.
Yeah, I think you have to blame the media and him.
Yeah.
And you have to say that everybody the rhetoric has amped up.
Yeah.
And everybody's contributed to that.
Sure.
He's contributed to that, and the media contributes to that, and you just see them going for the last 4 years from a 6 to an 11 in terms of the rhetoric. And that's where I think, going back to do justice to what Mohler's saying, yes, there's some track record there, and I don't take that lightly. I think I don't want to just dismiss that, and I don't want to say, that those aren't significant issues. And even that Mohler's point isn't valid to a degree in which you can say, yes, like a person's willingness to follow through on this policy should be a sort of a plus check mark on their character.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think with what Piper's saying, you have to look at the effects of Trump, and you have to say, will he in the short term accomplish these good things? Yeah, maybe he'll continue to do that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, though, I think we don't do ourselves any favor if we don't take seriously the way in which his character and demeanor have continued to erode the political discourse, the process of political discourse.
Yeah, and have the potential to do that long term.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you kind of imagine, like, what's next? Like, we're not, I mean, are we just going to go back to not, doing politics this way? I just don't see that happening. I don't see people doing it. And there's so many people that in the wake of sort of Trump have become little mini versions of him and talking in the same way. I mean, people in media and entertainment, where you look at major news organizations and they've just become like parodies of themselves, to where it doesn't matter if you go to this side or that side. Like the front page articles are so obviously partisan and biased that it's like, we're not even trying to have political discourse at this point. We are just full on hunkered down in the bunker, throwing propaganda at each other. Yeah. And I think it's not meanness, but you can't sit there and ignore the way in which he's contributed to that. And I'm not trying to say the media hasn't, they have, but they've been playing this sort of parasitic like game with each other, where they're doing it and he's doing it, and they're doing it and he's doing it, and they're doing it and he's doing it.
Yeah.
And then it's trickling down into the culture, and you see people online, and it's like, we have no ability to know how to have a political conversation at this point.
Absolutely. And I think, as Christians think about these two articles in particular, but in just thinking about Trump and Biden, I think it's important that we, just consider the fact that, Trump's been president for 4 years. I think it's important to just look back to 2016 and consider, have we gotten better in political discourse? Even within the church, has there been, more substantive dialogue? Are we able to understand our brothers and sisters and where they're coming from, or is there more of this presumption about, this person aligns with this politician, this must mean this.
They're insane. They don't.
Well, is our assumptions coming from conversations, actual dialogue, or is it again something that the reason we're doing a podcast like this? Is it just what you assume? Right, what you're seeing, the media tell you about the other side, what your particular station, how they're framing the issues. Is that how you understand the other Christians who maybe differ with you in your church? But I think all of this to say, the differences that we're going to see in our churches among Christians really will come down to a different weighing of issues. And you kind of hit on this earlier, but you see Mohler weighing the policies of Trump and the consistency at which he's gone about those policies to a greater degree than Piper does. Piper weighs these character issues in his private life and public life as well to be overshadowing the policy issues, right? So Piper isn't necessarily saying that.
I'll push back on that a little bit, because what I'll say is that I think Piper recognizes the policy issue is significant too, because if you look at the way he frames the article, it's, hey, these are both paths to destruction. One is a path via policy, like policies that, whether it's abortion or even just postmodern Marxism, which the Democrats and the left seem to be increasingly incapable of separating themselves from their most extreme elements. And man, you can't, this is worth a whole podcast in of itself, but you can't underestimate the problems that's going to bring to culture and political discourse itself. It's already causing problems in political discourse because it's already creating issues where you can't talk about a particular issue, or you are labeled as offensive for this reason or that reason, and so things become off limits. So that's destructive too. But I think what Piper's trying to do is he's trying to say, look, these are both bad choices. They're both bad choices for totally different reasons, and they're both leading to bad outcomes for totally different bad outcomes.
So and when I'm talking about weighing of these aspects of the election, I'm particularly speaking about Trump, voting for Trump or not voting for Trump, not necessarily voting for Biden or not, Biden or Trump or something like that. But yeah, I think what you're saying is true. I think that the reality is, though, there is room to differ among Christians because of that different assessment going on. How much weight do I put on, character versus how much weight do I put on policy and things like that.
Well, ultimately, we recognize it's a question of wisdom, which we're all going to have to wrestle through, and because to decide where's that intersection between these things, it's why we're willing to say, hey, this takes us talking through this question, what is the intersection between the destructiveness of his rhetoric and is that on balance going to outweigh any good that he might do in the long run? And I think if you ask Piper that question, then the answer is no. If you ask Mohler that question, the answer is going to be the opposite. And you have to basically see, instead of just saying, well, Piper's wrong and Mohler's right, or Mohler's wrong and Piper's right, I do think, and both of these men were pretty clear in their articles to say, I am not trying to bind anybody's conscience here, and I don't think we're trying to do that either. I'm trying to tell you how I did this, or how I came to the conclusion of what I came to in terms of what I'm voting for, and hopefully as a means of saying, hey, if you're out there struggling with trying to come to a conclusion, here's the conclusion I came to, and here's why. And I think that's where we give, if you talk to a brother or sister who voted for Trump, you ought to be able to go, man, maybe I wouldn't have made that decision, but I'm not gonna like, oh, how dare you? And I can't believe you do that. Like, you understand where Mohler's coming from, and it's a difficult thing. This is a difficult decision because you do have somebody whose policies are somewhat at odds with his character, and it's like, it's not a slam dunk. If Trump didn't have some of these questions in his character, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If his policies had been utterly terrible and he had done nothing, we wouldn't be having this discussion in this way. It's complicated, and it's complicated to know how these two things interface. And so having the charity to go, you sat down, you thought through it, and you came to this conclusion. He sat down, and he thought through it and came to this conclusion. Yeah. Well, let's be gracious on both of those, and let's be willing to love our brothers and sisters no matter where they come down, because ultimately we're all going to have to make that decision. Yeah. And I think both are valid decisions, and I want that to be clear, because whatever the case, I think, I think we've already made the case in some sensitive ways. If you ultimately decide to do that, there's some validity to that. Yeah. I think for Piper, like, if some of the arguments against the idea of his position is like, okay, but if you choose to not vote for Trump, or you choose to vote for a third party, or you choose to abstain, like, no, you can't do that because that's a vote for Biden. Yeah. And I think that's where you have to, like, and so people can get on a sort of put pressure on somebody to vote against their conscience and say, like, you can't care about these character issues because it's worse. Biden's worse because he wants to do all these things. Yeah. I think you just have to recognize, like, look, that's not how this works. Like,
it's not a Christian will think through those things.
No, and it's not like abstaining is a legitimate form of voting.
That gets into an important topic that I think is implicit in Piper's argument that may not be addressed as much in Mohler's argument, which is, are Christians obligated to vote in the first place, right? Yeah. If I'm coming into this election assuming, hey, like, I'm an American, I have a right that most of the world doesn't have, where I can actually participate in the leadership of who's going to be the leader of my country. Yeah. I have a say in that. I have a responsibility to do that. Is that true for Christians?
Well, I think there's some pressure that can be put on Christians for that. Like, I'll give an example. I was talking to a coworker the other day. He's an older gentleman. He's a veteran. And I said, man, I don't know what I'm going to do. I might not vote. And he said to me, I fought for that. I fought for your right to do that. And I put myself in a position that I sacrificed, and other people sacrificed their lives. And, like, how could you say you're not going to do that? Yeah. And I don't want to, like, in that moment, it was like, what am I going to say? I mean, I don't want to minimize the sacrifice that he's talking about. And it is important. And the ability to be able to vote. Yeah. Like the right and the ability to do that in human history, like, that's just rare. And the fact that we can do that, it's phenomenal. It's incredible. It's amazing that we live in a place and a time where we have that ability, and that people have fought for our right to be able to make those decisions and to contribute to that. Yeah. That being said, that does not force me into a position to choose between two options that I find both objectionable. Yeah. And so, essentially what I said to him was, I appreciate 100% what you're saying, and I appreciate 100% the sacrifice you've made to do that. But if tomorrow I woke up and someone said, hey, we're voting on a city ordinance, we got this kid, we're going to shoot him in the leg, or we're going to shoot him in the head, you got to choose. You got to go out and you got to vote. Yeah. Choose one of those two things. Shoot him in the head or shoot him in the leg. I fought for your right to vote. You got to go out and you got to make this choice. And and if you have parties that start to form and say, hey, if you don't vote to shoot him in the leg, if you try to go and abstain, or you don't go vote, that kid's going to get shot in the head, and that's going to be on you. Yeah. And I think that sometimes it's a little bit what some of the arguments against somebody like Piper, or somebody who wants to vote third party or not vote, is. It's like, you're responsible if Biden wins. You're not, though. Yeah. Like, you're not. You don't. We never have to feel like we do have the glorious right and the ability to vote, and that should never be downplayed. Yeah. That doesn't obligate us to make choices we disagree with.
Absolutely.
And
that's such an important thing when voting, is you want to vote your conscience. I mean, you don't want to sacrifice your conscience for the sake of fear of the other party.
Right.
And that's just, I mean, as Christians, we recognize that God is sovereign, that God is the one who establishes leaders in any context, even in a democratic context. I mean, God will ultimately decide who will win this November. I mean, that's just the reality. Because God is sovereign, he is in control of all things. He will see to it that the one who is supposed to be the candidate is the candidate.
Well, and that puts us in a position where we can be both willing to say, I'm not going to choose either of these options if I don't want to.
Yeah. Because the highest value is not, having your candidate or your party in political power. The highest value is following God.
Right. Doing what's virtuous.
Glorifying him. Exactly. And so we're trying to live as a Christian first before we live as a, political person.
Yeah. And I think that's where we can sort of say that no matter where you come down on this issue, because you're going to have to make a decision, maybe you already have, I think the best thing to do is to try to say, what does it look like for me to vote virtuously? And if you think voting virtuously, or what does it look like for consent to being, love for for existence in general? What does that look like when it comes to my voting? That if you tend to look at what Mohler's saying and you say, these other issues are too significant, and I think we can endure a little bit of this person's bad character for the sake of the good that will be furthered by these other things, then you're going to come down on that side.
Yep.
But if you say, even if there's good done in the long run, the destruction to this process is too significant, and we're going to undermine ourselves and our ability to discourse in the long run by continuing to sanction this kind of way of doing politics, this kind of way of talking in the political sphere. Even if in the short term we gain something from it, in the long term we're going to hurt ourselves. Then I think you're in a legitimate position to abstain or to vote third party. And I think Christians are going to have to decide that.
Yeah. And I think, again, both are legitimate options.
Yeah.
People will come down differently. They're going to vote differently. But as you mentioned earlier, as Christians, with other Christians in particular, we need to be charitable, which means that we need to understand how someone might come to a different conclusion than us.
Yeah.
And charity is not, let me think of the worst argument that this other person could have for voting in this way. It's the best possible argument. Right?
Yeah, and if we can endeavor to do that and show grace for that and say, look, I ultimately I came down on a different side of it, but I understand why you did what you did, and let's talk about it. And that's what we want to engender, is just say, like, look, if you still think you have somebody and you're like, man, I just don't know, like, I don't understand, talk to them. Sit down with that person and say, like, let's talk through this, and seek to legitimately talk through it, and seek to legitimately understand where the person's coming from, and hope that maybe they have something to say that's of value. But I think, as you said, just to kind of circle back, is it's at the end of the day, a decision is going to get made, and hopefully we find out sooner rather than later what that decision was. Whatever that decision is, God's not just sovereign, but he providentially determines the course of things. The sun rises, it goes back to where it was. People are elected, they're unelected. The new people are elected. Things continue on. We all die. We're all forgotten. Things will go on the way that they are. And in the end, all we can do is do our best to live lives that fear God and obey his commandments, and are willing to to love him and to honor him in everything that we do, and to have joy in the work that he's given us. And even no matter what the outcome of the election is, we can do that. No matter who gets elected, we can be happy in God, and we can be content and know that ultimately our existence is not conditioned upon either of these two people.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right.
Until next time.
This is the only one.